You really want someone exercising, controlling trauma, what exercise is, that's already acidic, that's already carrying 50 pounds too many. What happens if they twist their ankle, fall and fracture their hip? They are emotionally and physically done, not only with you, but in their minds, like, oh, I can never get well because I can't do what? Exercise. So when people talk about, oh, I'm doing this kettlebell routine, I just cringe. Or I'm doing remember step aerobics was a big thing back in the 80s? Why do you think that fell out of fashion? So much trauma. These other ballistic, what do they call them now? Ballistic training techniques. I had a gentleman in the office last week training ballistic for the fire academy, fractured his wrist, staying on a proprioceptive board and throwing a 10-pound ball or 20-pound ball up in the air. What's that?
A bunch of CrossFitters.
Yeah, CrossFitters.
They drank the Kool-Aid.
Yeah, it just boggles the mind. Here I'm trying to work on my proprioception, but I'm putting synthetic weights in my hand. I mean, come on. But yet these trainers are certified by a national agency. It just boggles the mind. So when you see a person like this, and again, I've got people on the program that are over 300 pounds with carrying 150 pounds of excess body fat. Last thing you want to do is to exercise that then. But what they are open to is something called 6 pillars. And I'm going to give you them now. Number 1, 3 hours before bed, no simple sugars. Because HGH is suppressed. Research talks about 1 gram of simple sugars within 3 hours before bed suppresses growth hormone release. And growth hormone is what's going to cut body fat down. Key hormone. So simple sugars are what? Fruits, fruit juices, dried fruit, synthetic sweetened drinks. Oh, Dr. George, you're against fruit? I'm against fruit 3 hours before bed. You see the difference? We have to qualify these statements rather than just giving arbitrary numbers like 200 grams a day. Just gives people no place to be, and then if they don't make any headway, guess what? They don't want to listen to anything. So that's the first 6 pillars. Number 2, dairy products. Dairy products have some negatives. I've got, I think, 29 peer-reviewed research papers that don't recommend dairy products. I'll give you a couple. The protein in dairy is called sodium caseinate, a very low quality, hard to digest protein. Now, some of you say, well, I drank milk when I was a kid. The same commercial cattle that are available now, the quality of the milk has declined so much, the cows would not be acceptable in Europe. And what they do is they measure something called the bacterial content coming out of their udder. And in Europe, the number is, I believe it's 1.2 million parts per million of bacteria. In this country, it's 1.7. And they're actually trying to push that to 2.1. So the quality, and even when we get to organic milk, the protein doesn't change, sodium caseinate. It's a low biological valued protein. And I'll get into that too in the slide presentation.
So you're talking about 3 hours before bed, or you're just talking about?
Well, I'm giving you the 6 pillars about dairy products. And then 3 hours before bed, no simple sugars. But as far as unfermented dairy, I don't recommend it. There's so many vegan choices: almond milk, rice milk, flax milk, unsweetened, that have no saturated properties. Remember, milk, once you get non-fat milk, and look it up online, please, the process to make it non-fat, pretty chemically, heavy.
How about 2%?
Same difference. But why even do that? Because you're getting a saturated. If I want saturated fat, give me a nice rare shoulder steak, extra rare, side of broccoli, and a Virgil's 0-calorie root beer. I'm a happy camper. So if I'm going to get saturated fat, give it to me in my steak, not in my white drink. And that's what Dr. Pravosky, a pediatrician, I took his seminar. That's what he calls all white drinks. He just calls them white drinks, whether it's rice, soy, almond, doesn't matter. So I have flax milk in my house for my daughter. She's lucky if we drink a half a gallon a month. And popular belief says, well, it's a good source of calcium. It's not a good source of usable calcium. Half a tomato has more usable calcium, raw tomato, than a full 8-ounce glass of milk. Usable. And here's the distinction. How many remember the Tums commercial? Tums has what? Calcium. But guess what? If you look at the label, it's calcium carbonate. If this was a chalkboard, that's the same chocolates on the chalkboard. has calcium, can't absorb it. There's several varieties. Calcium lactate, standard process, that's a good one. But calcium carbonate just runs. So what are all these millions of seniors doing? Taking Tums and end up with osteoporosis. So again, qualifications are key. So we have to look at the labels, unfortunately. I don't say these things happily. I wish we didn't have to do that. So that's 2 of the 6 pillars. Number 3. Vegetables. Make sure you're not eating raw ones, meaning crucible vegetables raw, like broccoli, asparagus, cauliflower. You don't like vegetables either, doctor? You're so rogue. No. We don't have the enzyme, the amylase enzyme, to break down the cellular wall in vegetable. So when you start talking about broccoli, it's a very crucible, very crunchy vegetable. Always steam that. If anyone here that goes to parties and eats raw broccoli, what do you end up getting that evening? Gas, because that product can't be broken down unless you're going to sit there and chew it all day. Then you're going to be, social pariah, because you're just going to be sitting there chewing your vegetables all day. So always al dente them, always steam them, break them down. Now things like romaine lettuce, kale, I think you're even pushing it with kale. The thinner ones, probably you can get away with it. Remember, we don't have that enzyme. We don't have the amylase enzyme. So that's why I'm pretty specific about that. So mainly the crucible ones. Number 4, white flour products. I'll talk about this in the slide presentation too. So the worst white flour products as far as a glycemic response. Remember, it's not me saying that they're bad. It's what the glycemic response is brominated flours. And guess where you find that in large supply in? Pizzas, Pizza Hut, Domino's. They've used the bromylation process, so it does what? Rises quickly so the pizza can cook faster. Okay? Huge insulin expression. Also, whenever you do this process of processing flours, it's a chemical called alloxan. How many of you heard of this chemical? They did a study where they found type 1 diabetic children, and they tested for the alloxan, and I'll show this to you in the slide presentation in a little bit. 8 times more elevation in alloxan in children with type 1 than children who didn't have type 1. What they're saying is there's most likely a correlation. And guess what alloxan is used for? To inducing type 2 diabetes in laboratory animals. So they induce that into the rats that they're testing on, and because inside the cell, inside the beta cell, it actually begins to destroy the beta cell, which is that and the islets of Langerhans begin to produce what? Insulin. So not only are you taking something that has a high glycemic load, but you're also taking something that has a direct attack on the beta cells in the pancreas. It's like a double-edged sword. So people say, oh, don't you ever eat white flour? Well, I guess I want to get a precursor to diabetes, I'll start. But knowingly, to know this and do that, it's not reasonable. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So you can look up alloxan. Wikipedia gives a very good definition of it. I think that chemical was produced early in the 1800s to produce the type 2 diabetes in laboratory animals. Any questions to this point? Okay, let's get back to lean body mass and supporting it. It's important for a number of reasons. What's the most dynamic tissue? I know you guys are going to know this, but I want to hear it anyway. What's the most dynamic tissue in the body?
Muscle.
Muscle and bone are almost neck and neck, right? But that's pretty accurate. So when we don't support it with amino acids, the building blocks of life, do they even still call them that? That's when I was in school, that's what they were called, the building blocks of life. If we don't support amino acid intake in our diet, guess what will happen to the muscle tissue? It will catabolize, it will break down and go away. So what happens is when you don't support your lean muscle mass, guess what happens to your body fat? It goes up, and there's a problem in LA that they call it skinny fat. These young people, 120 pounds, are walking around with 60% body fat. Because they're doing what? They're dieting and all this other insane practices They're not supporting their lean body mass, so what's happening is it's catabolizing, so their weight may be dropping, but guess what's happening to their body fat elevation? And their disease processes are all going right along with it. So the direct correlation between elevation of body fat and disease proliferation in the body, no question. So let's go back to these numbers. So if someone has 120-pound lean body mass, and I recommend, and several other authorities that I have a lot of respect for recommend 0.5 grams, so half a gram per pound lean body mass, their protein intake should be about 20 grams per day. Makes sense, right? Now there's some caveats to that number. The federal government gives protein something called a biological value, BV. You can look it up online. There's all kind of cool charts. I have a couple of them in my presentation I'll show you. And guess what the benchmark is? The number one, mother's milk. Mother's milk, or what all of the proteins are based on, because it's almost 100% absorbable. Because what's phenomenal about mother's milk is when the baby latches onto the breast, that it will construct that milk for that feeding. That's how phenomenal the human body is. If the baby needs more water, needs more protein, needs more, whatever it needs, and the mother can do it, the breast will make the milk for that particular feeding. So that's why one of the reasons why the biological value is so high. That simply means if 100 grams are taken in, how much of that can get into the cell? Like 99.9. So it is the benchmark. So whatever graph you pull up by biological value, you'll see mother's milk as being number one. If it's not, you're looking at the wrong graph. Number two, one of the only products I recommend that's dairy-based is whey protein isolate. It's about a 96 to 98% bioavailable. It's derived from dairy, so if someone has a severe milk intolerance, they may not do well, but I would say 8 times out of 10, there's never a problem with it, because it's the protein of the high biological value protein source. But it's whey isolate, which has the highest, again. So what's interesting is when you take someone who has this and they're not even eating 0.3, sometimes you need to take a meal replacement. Whey isolate, I recommend 1 scoop is 20 grams. They do 2 scoops a day and they need to be 60. This person needs to be 60. 2 scoops a day, they're already at 40 with 2 scoops. So they have 20 to do with their food eating. Now, once they start to do that consistently, magical things happen. And I only realized how important this was a couple years ago. I didn't know how to implement it practically, reasonably. All these theories and formulas are out there, but this is something someone can grapple with. And again, as they become more knowledgeable, they can begin to massage those numbers based on their activity level, based on their condition. Maybe they have renal issues. There's been a lot of talk about, well, high protein diets, damage the kidneys. Well, let's qualify that. We're talking about meat protein, which is hard to digest. We have to get more qualified rather than just throwing out like the 200 grams out to arbitrary numbers. Make sense? Any questions at this point? It'll get clear when I throw some slides at you. I just want to preface. So when you see the slides, you'll see these 3 numbers, and you'll be able to calculate out the person's lean body mass support. So once we start getting in this dimension, now we're looking at someone that's a triathlete, wants to compete at, I've gotten athletes down to 5% body fat, and this number sometimes even greater for a short period of time helps them to do that. Remember, the highest calories, fat is 9 grams, protein and carbs are 7 each. But when you do this type of work, you don't even get involved in calorie counting or weighing of food. Okay. Any questions at this point? I told you I try not to give you guys verbal sedatives today. Try to make it exciting and practical. And again, the book doesn't talk about too much of lean body mass. It gets more into fundamental meal plans. And one of the comments I get in my book is, well, you have fruit as the last snack of the day, but you say no simple sugars before bed. Okay. There's a lot of psychology going on when you're dealing with patients with type 2 diabetes. The reason is they've had chronic health problems for decades. So if they're used to eating M&Ms, while they're watching TV, and you want them to say, oh, I can have some fruit before bed, it's a step in the right direction. The ultimate goal is no simple sugars 3 hours before bed, but maybe that's too extreme for them. You see? So there's a lot of psychological components in the person's emotional state that needs to be recognized by whoever's working with them, because it's huge. And if someone would have said, my first 10 years in practice, oh, you have to take the emotional component in, ridiculous, I would have thought. In my week 2 of my program, I actually give an audio of an emotional exercise to begin to clear out some problems. It's a real simple one, and I'll go through that with you later today too. And I'm not trying to be a psychiatrist or a psychologist, but they have to come to grips with why they allowed their health to get where it is. If they're morbidly obese, something happened to them. Maybe it was sexual abuse as a child. Maybe it was a failed marriage. Maybe it was something. And that needs to be brought up and dealt with so they can get past the neural-emotional point and get into the physical, okay, what am I doing eating myself into these problems? So I try to address those, but the book gives, and the coursework gives core fundamentals that are super important. Okay, does this make sense? The lean body mass calculations, they're real simple. And again, you guys will have those, they're pretty simple to figure out. And the bioimpedance that I talk about, you can pick those scales up for like $30. If you go to my website, it's on my card. What I had done was all the things that I recommend that I use, I put there so people can just go in one place, and the weight is there, the bioimpedance scales are there, things of that nature. So it's not, we can't make it too big of a leap, because remember, people are looking for any reason. You docs know this. For some reason, I don't think I should have used green today. They're looking for any reason not to move forward. Any reason, because in their minds, remember we're talking about chronicity, and Doc, who does a lot of work with chronic patients, is in their mind, the first thing that comes to their thoughts is, I've been there and done that. The lady who's with me, who's dropped close to 50 pounds, did National Weight Watchers, Jenny Craig, packaged meals, all this sort of thing, counting the numbers. But obviously something that I presented in the live feed that I'm doing now and in my book clicked with her. Because again, I try to work on the emotional points of why they've gotten where they're at. So we have to remove this barrier. Why not to move forward? That's the trick, isn't it? Because a lot of us work with patients. We know they need so much care. They know they need, better monitoring. They need to listen to the primary. But why aren't they doing it? That's the question to ask. What's the resistance?
Discipline. They don't have discipline. I know that.
Well, discipline comes from, in my opinion, 2 motivations: love and fear.
Laziness. That's the big thing.
Possibly, but consider this. Love and fear are the 2 biggest emotions we deal with in our lives, I think, based on what I've read. Chopra talks about it. Several other, Wayne Dyer talked about it. Those emotions have to be activated somehow in order for people to move forward. Maybe it's a love of seeing their grandson graduate, and they're, that's not going to be for several years. Maybe it's, they don't want to let their family down because they're being ill. All these things I kind of bring up, and one of the first things I ask when I'm working one-on-one with someone is, why do you want to get better? I get this step back face. And then if the spouse, if they're together, they look at each other, and it's almost a mind-boggling question to them. Because no one's ever what? No one's ever asked. They've always assumed, well, you want to get better. Of course you do. No, not necessarily. Remember the lady I told you about who, if she got better, her daughter would go back to Montana? There's all kind of motivations people are having of why they move forward with a program or a system or your advice, and why they don't. And I think as practitioners, we need to step back and say, okay, what aren't we saying, or what are we saying that's either compelling them to move forward or compelling them to stop? We need to take responsibility for that and get more into the dynamics rather than just saying, just do this and do that. I remember Dr. Parkash told me, we went to school together a couple of years apart, and there was a pathologist there, Dr. Prem Parkash, probably one of the brightest guys I ever know. He was one of the doctors that when you're cramming for an exam, the last day, you ask him a question, he knows more about the problem than you do. You've been studying for 2 weeks, one of those types of docs. But talked about it in a way that made so much sense. And he said, I remember he telling me, you have passion, I think you're going to be really good at practice, but he said, don't forget one thing. He said, decide whether you want to be right or you want to help someone. Which do you want to do? I was thinking, I walked away thinking, oh, Dr. Prakash, you're too deep for me. I just want to go into practice. But now I'm in practice for 20 plus years, and I realize he's absolutely right. Because the tendency for people who have chronic illnesses like type 2 diabetes is they've been made wrong so much, been told they're lazy or it's your fault, or they just accepted that as a casual reality, but no one's really asked them, why do you want to get better? Well, I'm afraid of dialysis. Okay, that's a good reason. Let's work through that. And then you begin to ask them, and like I said, my second week of my program, there's an audio that has them do an exercise. So you begin to pull these things out that no one's ever asked them about. And I think you'll be surprised if you start seeing patients when you go back in your office on Monday and you have someone with chronic illness. It's, we all have seen them. They bring in their file that's 1.5 inches thick, or they bring in all their CDs. Just ask them. Trust me. Why do you want to get better? You're going to see a look that you'll probably never see. That you'll get a look that no other question will bring that out in them, because no one's probably ever asked them that. So there's a lot of psychological things going on when dealing with chronic patients, and type 2 diabetes and pre-diabetes and metabolic syndrome fits in that category. Any questions at this point? How are we doing on time? 50. Why don't we take 10-minute break?
Doctors, if you would like to pre-order lunch
Hey guys.
at the restaurant here, you can come to the registration table and give me your order.
I'll be
make sure
back.
that it's